I'm not of the school that some of my colleagues in a number of other universities at least have, where they enjoy intellectual conversation simply for the sake of intellectual conversation. I think that is important. I think that's valuable. But I think that if you invest money in arranging things or in bringing speakers out, you also have to ensure, that's the least important reason, but it is an important reason, you also have to ensure that that there is as wide an amount as possible of people who also come to the occasion. Which brings me to a comment or two that I wanted to make before I introduce Professor Charles Amjad Ali about the intellectual project. In the more developed countries, there has for long, especially after the Enlightenment, there has for long been the idea that people pursue academic work, intellectual work, for its own sake, and that there are notions of objectivity that goes around with this. And objectivity in turn have been tied to notions of the disemboweled intellectual. And this in turn has often been tied to the idea of reason as some, not even a tangible element, but as something that rotates out there, that some people can grasp, and master. And that you master this quality disemboweled from your personal history, disemboweled from your social context. You still have traces of this in a country like Germany, for example, where a breed of intellectual that is really looked down upon is the intellectual that is read in newspapers and is seen on TV. Intellectuals aren't supposed to be read by the masses. Intellectuals aren't supposed to be seen by the masses. I had a colleague at Harvard who was proud of the fact that every semester there was a maximum of 3 people who were eligible to take classes with him. And there was a huge aura around him at the fact that for some semesters only 1 student was eligible for his class. People remember a year in which nobody was eligible for his class. And people speak about this particular colleague with awe. With awe they speak about him. And so there is this element in the academy, largely flowing from the Enlightenment, that the further up in our towers we rise, the better the higher the gravitas of our intellectual standing is. Now, somewhere between this idea and the idea that the university is a glorified primary school or a glorified high school where anybody can just come in, whether they can write a single sentence in Latin or English. And increasingly, by the way, and this is a bit of the point, but increasingly we are beginning to find out that it isn't English that is the problem of our students. That has been commonly made out to be the case often. But the fact that our students are increasingly illiterate in all languages. You see this, for example, in the colored community, where we grew up speaking Afrikaans, where Afrikaans-speaking parents who are ill-equipped in English, but they're speaking English to their children, a pathetic English to their children, and the children are growing up with this pathetic English because the parents want the children to climb socially. So the problem is not just that our students aren't equipped in English, but that if they were trained in their mother tongue, that they would actually be doing better. There is another process going on, connected to a larger project in the world, the dominance of English in the world, but and that is connected to another, that there is only one civilization that is worth emulating, and that is the Western civilization. It is the Northern civilization. There is only one intellectual tradition worth emulating, and that is the Enlightenment tradition, despite the fact that many critical thinkers in the West, post-Enlightenment thinkers, are increasingly acknowledging the idea that this is a whole lot of nonsense, the idea of a disemboweled human being without ideological judgment in his or her head, a genderless human being, a sexless human being, a classless human being, and that, and as if we have no prejudices whatsoever. And so, I mean, from my perspective, certainly, the question of religion studies in the academy, it's not simply one of us having to survive because our legitimacy is always being threatened by our colleagues in the social sciences, and more particularly our colleagues in the so-called pure sciences. That is one reason why we have to survive, but that is really a secondary reason. The big reason why we have to survive is simply because if a university is, firstly, the nonsense, the rejection of this ideologylessness or the amorphous disemboweledness of the intellectual, this on the one hand, and on the other hand, I'm sorry, but we have come from a period where the sciences were used for the most vicious forms of discrimination and entrancing racism. Many, many doctoral theses at this university, at many other universities, were written to prove that black people were genetically or culturally, naturally inclined to be inferior. Verwoerd was a professor in theology at the age of 23, or was it philosophy? A full professor. This was the intellectual brilliance of the man. What was the ideological project that he was a part of? And so this is the larger context, people, for this, as slow as it may be in taking off, small in numbers as it may be taking off, as a part of this commitment to locate ourselves where our people are at. In a university, you can't speak of our people. But I very deliberately am wearing this T-shirt today. I founded an organization, or I co-founded an organization called Positive Muslims, an organization that works with Muslims that are HIV positive. Quite frankly, I'm tired of being a believer in a new world in the closet at a university, pretending, you know, that I'm just an academic and so on. is gatvol van tyd. Ek wil 'n bietjie wys vir die mense waarvandaan ek kom, wie ek is en so aan. It is in this context, people, that we are having this discussion on some aspects of Christianity in the world today and in society today. Partly, part of thinking also, how do we reposition ourselves as intellectuals, as scholars of religion studies, some of us as theologians, in meeting the demands of our country, meeting the demands of our people, disaggregated as they may be, unacademic as it may be to talk about our people as a blob. For the pragmatic academic in a religion, there is one unescapable truth. For the prophetic theologian, in his or her vocation, there is one unescapable truth. The unescapable truth for the theologian located inside his or her theological tradition is that no single founding figure of any religious tradition came along and asked, how do I fit into the world? How do I fit in with dominant structures? All founding figures of all religious traditions started off, how do I challenge the dominant system? Not how do I build a career and make it inside a dominant system. So that goes for all people who locate themselves inside a religious tradition. For the many of us who don't locate ourselves inside a religious tradition, but who find ourselves studying religious communities and find ourselves inside the academy, certainly at a university like this, there is one non-negotiable truth. The taxpayer puts our bread and butter on the table. Die mense betaal ons salarisse. We work for the people. And so our agendas simply have to meet the demands of our people. So it's a negotiation, but we must work towards finding a medium between where we are as intellectuals and thinkers and the needs, the cries of the people who provide our bread and butter on the table. So those are some of my opening comments.